Welcome to Eager Space. We've grown used to a world where there is a huge reliance on SpaceX. Falcon 9 is one of the most successful rockets ever, Starship is maybe going to start flying real payloads soon, and transport to the ISS is largely dependent on Dragon flights. And there's this internet constellation called Starlink. But what if none of that existed? What if SpaceX never existed? Let's rewind the clock back to the early 2000s. Elon Musk was one of the founders of a financial services company known as X.com, which ended up merging with another company called Confinity, with the merged company changing their name to PayPal in 2001. Musk was looking for something interesting to do next. PayPal was planning to go public, and that would give him some money to invest in something. He was unhappy with the current state of the space program, and he came up with an idea called Mars Oasis. It would send a tiny greenhouse to Mars to grow some plants, and with any luck, wake people up and bring more attention to the space program. He had a problem, however. He couldn't afford to launch on any of the US rockets, so that took him to Moscow to try to procure a launch vehicle, meeting with companies that converted SS-18 missiles to launch vehicles. Musk and the Russians were unable to reach agreement, and on the flight home, Musk decided to start his own rocket company. But what if they had reached an agreement and Musk focused all his time on Tesla instead? That is our alternate universe, and we're going to explore what that universe might look like in 2026. In 2006, the newly formed United Launch Alliance was flying the Atlas V and the Delta IV, and, as the only US launch provider, they were making a mint. The Atlas V launches brought in about $200 million each, and the Delta IV Heavy launches brought in more than $400 million. Better still, ULA got paid to be able to launch payloads even if the Air Force had no payloads to launch, and those launch capability payments were between $500 million and a cool $1 billion per year. A very good business. In the real world, SpaceX ruined the party by suing the Air Force in 2014, and they started flying missions in late 2018. SpaceX was much cheaper than ULA. This was an existential threat for ULA, and they responded by developing the Vulcan rocket. Without SpaceX, the picture is different. The Atlas V first stage was powered by a Russian RD-180 engine, and that choice became untenable after Russia started invading countries. Perhaps the Atlas V gets re-engined, or maybe Vulcan gets developed anyway. It's a good bet, however, that ULA is still charging premium prices to the Air Force, and still making tons of money on the deal. And flying a bunch of NASA missions, another gift because of being the only US launch company. Ariane had worked hard to cement their position as the premier launcher of payloads to geostationary orbit, mostly communication satellites, flying the Ariane 5. They flew 2 satellites per mission, a larger one for about $100 million and a smaller one for $65 million. Payloads were also launched by the Russian Proton for customers who didn't want to wait for an Ariane launch, and were okay with the low reliability of Proton. The cost of Proton was about $65 million per payload. SpaceX started flying these satellite payloads in 2013, and quickly took over the market that Proton had filled, and started competing with Ariane 5. That put enough pressure on Ariane that they decided to develop Ariane 6 as a cheaper launcher, and after many delays, it first flew in 2024. But while Ariane 6 was under development, SpaceX started launching their Starlink low Earth orbit communications constellation in 2019, and that has changed the world of geosynchronous communication satellites. Without SpaceX and Starlink, the market is mostly about geostationary satellites, and Ariane 5 still dominates. Proton still picks up some payloads, and Ariane 6 might not have been developed. And OneWeb and Iridium probably do better, though they don't have the reach that Starlink does. I don't think we see Amazon LEO, Blue Origin TerraWave, or any of the orbital data center proposals, all of which are built on the success of Starlink. One of the unappreciated impacts of SpaceX was the impact they had on the ability of companies to gain funding. Skybox Imaging got their first VC funding in 2010 and ended up with a total of $91 million through 2012. 2013 saw a number of companies get small amounts of funding, including Planet Labs, Rocket Lab, and Spire Global. During this time period, it was very difficult to get VC funding for space. There just wasn't any interest. But then in 2015, we saw SpaceX get $1 billion investment, and OneWeb got a $500 million investment. That led to this world, where a large number of VC funds were created to fund space companies, and those funds spawned many of the companies that we think about today. Without SpaceX, the market would likely still be stuck at pre-2015 levels of funding, and the world would be without the transporter and bandwagon missions, which have flown payloads for more than 100 different companies, making getting into orbit much cheaper and much easier. Now let's look at some companies. What about Rocket Lab? This is a very interesting question. My guess is that they can get enough funding to get Electron flying out of New Zealand. And if that happens, they're in a pretty good position. They can do 300 kilograms to orbit for roughly $12 million. Northrop Grumman's air-launched Pegasus does 443 kilograms for $40 million. And their other competitors are, well, I think most of them are non-existent, because they would rely on venture capital money that doesn't exist. There's a decent chance that Electron becomes a sort of mini SpaceX, if they have the market to themselves. And assuming they move to the US the way they did in the current world, I think they pull in a lot of government launches. And I suspect that they probably do develop a medium-lift rocket to compete with ULA, though I don't think they do reusability, at least not right away. So many questions about Blue Origin. They flew New Shepard with humans in 2021, going about as high as Shepard Classic went in 1961. The next benchmark would be Glenn Classic, which put about 3,000 kilograms into low Earth orbit, near the bottom of the medium lift classification. That's a pretty significant challenge for a first orbital rocket, with Falcon 1 doing 470 kilograms and Electron doing 300 kilograms. But instead of trying to stay with the program and do a medium-class rocket, they decided to aim for a heavy lift vehicle that could do 45 tons, 45,000 kilograms to orbit. It's playing on hard mode, and space is hard enough that you don't need the extra challenge. They were hoping to compete with Ariane 5, also flying 2 payloads per rocket, which honestly is a pretty poor idea. Don't try to compete with your competitor where they're strong, strike where they are weak. And along the way, SpaceX started reflying boosters, so that had to be part of New Glenn as well. How does this picture look different if SpaceX isn't around? Hard to tell. I think some of the choices that Bezos has made are based on trying to catch up with what SpaceX has already done. And maybe without that driver, they pick goals that are a little more attainable and don't spread themselves across so many projects. Or maybe it looks pretty much like it does now. NASA commercial cargo and crew is where things get really interesting. The Columbia accident in 2003 sped up the process of shuttle retirement, and the shuttle would only fly until 2011. NASA really needed a way to replace the shuttle capabilities to be able to effectively utilize their newly completed space station. In 2006, NASA announced that SpaceX and Kistler had won Phase 1 of the COTS program. In 2007, Kistler failed their fundraising requirements, and they were replaced in 2008 by Orbital Sciences. Cargo Dragon would first fly to the ISS in May of 2012, and Cygnus would fly roughly a year later, in September of 2013. Commercial crew awards to SpaceX and Boeing followed in 2014. Crew Dragon flew its first crewed mission in 2020 and has been operational since. Boeing Starliner flew its first crewed mission in 2024, but is yet to become operational. Between the end of Shuttle and the missions with Crew Dragon, the only way for humans to get to the ISS was on a Russian Soyuz spacecraft, and that was both a significant cost for NASA and a loss of national pride. Congress was not happy. What if SpaceX wasn't around? The lack of Cargo Dragon hurts, but Cygnus has been mostly reliable, though quite a bit more expensive. The lack of Crew Dragon hurts a lot more. Soyuz would still be the only way to get astronauts to the ISS, and that could be problematic with the current relationship between the US and Russia. But it would probably have been worse than that. NASA's original plan for commercial cargo was to give $227 million to Kistler in 2004, despite the fact that Kistler had filed for bankruptcy the year before. This award clearly had nothing to do with the fact that Kistler was run by Apollo program legend George Mueller. The only reason this didn't happen was that SpaceX sued NASA, and NASA quickly caved and set up the COTS competition that led to Cargo Dragon and Cygnus. Maybe somebody else might have sued, but if that didn't happen, it's pretty likely that Kistler would be the only company working on commercial resupply, and there's a good chance that it just kills the whole rest of the program. No Orbital Sciences Cygnus, and no Boeing Starliner. And given their track record, it seems unlikely Kistler would have been successful. That would have been a tremendous issue for NASA, with no commercial options, which leaves only the Russians. But no, there is another. Back when commercial cargo was starting, NASA was working on the Constellation program, which envisioned the Ares 1 rocket to carry astronauts into orbit, including to the space station, and the Ares 5 rocket to go back to the moon. The downside was that it was estimated that the Ares 1 would cost nearly $1 billion a flight. That was pretty hard to swallow, given that Shuttle flew 5 missions in 2009, and the total cost was about $4 billion, or only $800 million per flight for a much more capable vehicle. NASA accomplished very little with the Constellation program in the 5 years that it was running, and there were serious concerns about putting astronauts on the Ares 1, as it used a shuttle solid rocket booster as a first stage, along with the very expensive Orion capsule. The program was canceled in 2010, and it was replaced by the Commercial Crew program. Cargo was already in progress, and the SLS and Orion programs. When the SLS and Orion program was created, it was tasked with being able to deliver crew or cargo to the ISS if there were no alternatives. In our world, NASA never seriously considered that, likely because SLS and Orion are the silliest choice to perform that task. It's stupid big and stupid expensive. But what if there were no commercial cargo or crew options? Would NASA keep depending on Soyuz, or would they try to develop the capability using SLS and Orion? That's a hard one to predict. The economics of SLS and Orion are terrible, but flying astronauts on the Russian Soyuz caused a lot of political issues for the time that NASA did it, and if there were no alternative on the horizon, it seems possible that NASA would have to do something. As for the Artemis program and the lunar landers, without SpaceX there is no Starship-based lunar lander. Maybe the Blue Origin-led national team wins the first contract if Blue Origin is working on lunar stuff. Maybe one of the other big primes bids on it and wins it. It likely costs at least double the cost of the current landers, and is almost sure to take longer. Maybe Artemis landings happen, maybe they don't. That is, of course, the exact state we are in right now anyway, so this might be an area where the absence of SpaceX isn't that big of a deal. Who are the winners and losers? ULA is the top winner. They keep their monopoly for NSSL and NASA launches, though they likely still have to do Vulcan, but they likely charge DoD to do it because nobody wants to keep flying Delta IV. That makes the Space Force a big loser. They don't get to benefit from SpaceX innovation, and they pay many billions more for their launches. Arianespace is likely a big winner as well. They don't need to spend the money to develop Ariane 6, as they don't end up with any real pricing pressure. I'm also going to call Roscosmos a bit of a winner, as they keep getting paid to fly payloads on Proton. Space startups are losers. The biggest factor is the launch of venture capital funding. The launch cost is also a killer. If Rocket Lab becomes any replacement for SpaceX, maybe it's not quite as bad. Hard to see how this could be anything but positive for Rocket Lab. It might be a little harder for them to raise money, but if they are the only private company out there, they can likely get enough to build their own medium-lift rocket. NASA will need to choose between a more expensive commercial cargo and crew, or no program at all. None of the alternatives are great, unless Rocket Lab becomes the SpaceX replacement. NASA launch prices for science missions go up because they're stuck with ULA. And that's all for this video. It's hard to overestimate the impact of SpaceX in the last 15 years. I have a related video on how SpaceX might have failed that might be interesting. I'm also gathering questions for a summer question and answer video. My current plan is to concentrate on questions from the viewers that are nice enough to support me through a monthly membership. You can join the channel by clicking on the Join button underneath the video title. You will then have access to this video, and you can ask questions in the comments. And thanks to all who are already supporting me. Today's song is Roll the Bones by Rush off their 1991 album of the same name.